A hearty and celebratory good day from Professor Tim Moore of the Center on the Study of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin, Professor Chris Kavanaugh from Bismarck, North Dakota, Dr. James Michael Williams, Department of Political Science, University of San Diego, and myself, David Richmond from Trump Central, California, to our 16th episode of the Constitution in American Life. I am just coming down from nearly a week of celebratory smiles as my Los Angeles Dodgers captured the World Championships for the 9th time, defeating the New York Yankees 4-1 in the series. Now it is on to the election of 2024 and the nervous anticipation. Yeah, is that it? That is the one great unifier for all Americans at this time in history. Before we get on to our discussion found in Unit 6 of the We the People State questions, I wanted to ask Professor Moore to address a question I received from a civics teacher in my own community who said they heard a rumor that the Center for the Study of the Constitution was closing its doors, and they wondered what that meant as far as access to their resources. Mr. Moore, do you have something you can share with those teachers?
Yeah, well, many people know that our center is the organization that has largely housed we call it the Ratification Project, and we just shipped off this last week, I think, our 43rd volume to our printer. So in 50 years, we've done 43 volumes, all kind of documents related to the ratification in all the states. So the National Archives and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the main funders of our project, have said no more money for you. So we're trying to figure out if the center has a lifespan beyond just this documentary edition set of volumes we've been doing, and we're investigating some other funding sources. So actually, this week or early next, those entities will be meeting to decide whether they're going to continue funding us in some sort of modified, we might be an educational outreach entity solely, as opposed to an academic project. So yeah, it's like a lot of question marks right now around the offices, but and that's one of our main concern too. What happens to the website? I think we've noticed there's been a spike since we've been doing this program. I don't know how people find their way to our website. But anyway, so we're paramount in our minds is if we do shut down, we've got to find a way to keep that website operational.
All right. Well, keep us updated there on that, and we will announce that to teachers and students. So it is now time to provide teachers with our question of the day, which is intended to spark discussion amongst classes and small groups alike. The question of the day is as follows. Should the president's power to pardon include members of his own or her own cabinet and staff who have been found guilty of committing crimes, as well as him or herself? That is, should the president be able to pardon themselves? So I hope you enjoy that conversation and let us know how that goes. So speaking about a period in time, let's find out what our scholars think about this day in history. In 1979, is it a minor, mid-major, or major event in history? On this day in 1979, over 50 Americans were taken hostage by Islamic fundamentalists in Iran. All right. Well, they would be held for 444 days. And I won't make any comment because that might steer you one way or the other. But Professor Moore, minor, mid-minor, mid-major, major?
Well, at the time, I kind of thought minor because I was in college. I mean, I very, very much remember that 444 days. It has become a major. Just the whole meaning of the Iranian Revolution, I think, for most Americans, myself included, really didn't understand the Ayatollah coming back to Iran. I mean, as a kid, I never heard anything about Sunni and Shia. So I think that was a harbinger of so many significant events that the Iranian Revolution kind of has unleashed on world history. So at the time, I was paying attention to it, but I think we're still kind of in a Cold War framework, although I know there's a way to configure the Iranian Revolution in a Cold War frame narrative, but it didn't seem like much at the time, but it really, I think, has unleashed major, major events around the world.
Professor Williams.
That's a good take, Tim. I'm gonna go mid-major because I'm just gonna focus on. I think it's a good point about how it spawned events around the world, but within the United States, I think it comes at the end of a series of events that had really showed America's sort of political and economic decline. I'm thinking about the Vietnam War, Watergate, stagflation we're going through. And this event was kind of like the last one, not the last one, but in those series of events that kind of left an opening for someone like Ronald Reagan and this new sort of conservative movement to really break through, because there really was an argument to be made that America was not the same superpower it was even 10 to 15 years before. So I'm going to say mid-major only because I think if that event just happens on its own, I'm not sure if it's going to have the same effect. But given where it happened in that decade, I think it's definitely important.
Professor Kavanaugh.
I'm going to have to go major. I think that it was a major event at the time, and I think it's been a major event for the last 50 plus years since it occurred. I mean, if you look at the division, between what we used to do when the Shah was in place, obviously we put him in place, and Jimmy Carter, then President Carter, letting him come into the country for cancer treatments, after he had been replaced by the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollah, and theocracy was put in place where it certainly wasn't a democracy, that's for sure, under the Shah and his secret police. They were pretty brutal. But I mean, if you look at the events of the last 55 years plus since it's created a huge division in the Middle East, and it's been Iran has been, I don't know, I don't want to use the term paper tiger, but they certainly have been behind a lot of the unrest in the Middle East. When you think about the people that we believe that they fund, whether it be Hezbollah or Hamas and other folks. So I think it's a major event.
So and when I read this, part of me was thinking about what I vividly remember, I guess, and this is all in hindsight. I think I'm with Tim at the time, being in college at the time, but in hindsight, what I remember is that it happened during an election. That is, the bulk of this was going on during the election period, and that for the second time in my lifetime, during an election period, one of the parties is playing games with foreign policy. I think about '68 and the Nixon campaign, sending secret envoys to negotiate with the South Vietnamese and not to do certain things until after the election. And then Reagan does the same thing, not to release the hostages, not to do anything until after the election. And what is it? Is it the inauguration day?
Yeah.
Yep.
That they're actually released.
Split screen.
Yeah, split screen kind of thing. So I don't know, for some reason, thinking about politics and the whole idea that when it came to foreign policy, politics stopped at the water's edge, and I don't know how true that's been in my lifetime there. So, well, thank you, gentlemen, on your insights on that historic event in 1979. Today, students and teachers, the discussion is focused on Unit 1, Question 2 from the We the People State Questions, which asks students to comment and evaluate the impact of the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights on American political thought and practice. So as always, let's start with our ghost from the 18th century past, Professor Tim Moore. Tim, I got to ask, and this is probably, I don't know, maybe it's a fifth grade question, or it's just the question of an elderly man whose mind is wasting away here. But I gotta wonder if the American Revolution is centered, which we're taught from fifth grade, on, is centered on rejecting the British political system. Why do Americans after the revolution take so many principles and ideas from the British when constructing their government? It seems to be, contradictory. We don't want your system. We hate your system. Oh, let's take your system.
Well, students, this is a great opportunity, and I think we've said this before in like advice to students. Sometimes you need to take exception to the premise of a question. With all due respect, David, I respect you. You know that I love you dearly, and I have to take exception to the premise of your question. I don't think we did borrow much from the British. Now, I mean, okay, we got three branches, um, but so I guess the framework kind of looks the same at first glance, but the operation of those branches is anything but British. I mean, for example, representation in our system is very different than the British. Um, we move more towards geographic representation rather than virtual representation. There's prohibition against office holding, in other capacities. There's, prohibition of nobility, titles of nobility. Judicial independence is not something that the British would have had. That's something that's key in our system. Expansion, there's an expansion of voting, not as clearly as much as has occurred since the founding, but territorial policies, how it works, a Congress's oversight and their treatment of territories, a way to gain access on an equitable basis, very un-British. The executive is very different, elected, and doesn't
Kind
have
of, kind of elected.
well, well, I mean, okay. I'm just saying at the time, if we can stay there. Sorry. Sorry, I have to be a curmudgeon here because I mean, after that, I have no dignity here, and there's a discussion. But the executive branch is very different in the sense that they don't have formally anybody in the Congress, this king in parliament. We don't adopt that. So I think there's plenty. The way I read it, David, yeah, it kind of looks the same, but operationally it's very, very different. So maybe we do a disservice to fifth graders in explaining the American Revolution that way.
And I really appreciate you using this as a model for students to question the premise
Yeah.
of the question there. But the question the
I'm
students
I'm
have to
half thinking I'm half thinking you did this on purpose, frankly, because
no,
come on.
that would grant me a level of intelligence and tactical approach to this that I just don't possess here. But the question that the students have to deal with implies that. I mean, we're going to talk about the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and their influence on American notions of this. So that seems to imply that we're taken from the British. And
Well, but
again,
even
go
but
ahead.
even Magna Carta, and English Bill of Right, Petition of Right, they're all kind of, I mean, I've used this phrase before. Eventually, this would be called this Whig suspicion of centralized power. Now, we kind of take that. I mean, if we did borrow anything, I think that Whig suspicion of centralized power is something that we do borrow, but also those documents are often seen as rights stories, the rights being the theme of those documents. And I think in that sense, okay, if we want to, have do a tree here with the roots and the branches and all that kind of stuff, the rights story run deep in these documents. But the functions of government, I think, is a little bit different in terms of us borrowing from the British.
Russ
I think I
Kavanaugh.
would agree with the rights assessment. And I put another link in our resources that deal with that. There's a link we had in a different show, but it's the same link. It charts out the British documents as well as colonial documents. And I want to stress the colonial documents role in
Yeah.
determining rights on this side of the Atlantic. And the other thing I want to make sure I point out, because people talk about this unique nature of American federalism, but we actually, we lived under a federal system. We had a strong central government. It just happened to be in England. We had regional governments that were colonial governments that were chartered through the government in England. So we actually existed under a federal system with layers of government. Just had a long period where mom and dad were not paying attention to us. That period of salutary neglect. So the federal system is not necessarily that new either. So I just want to throw that out there.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, one of the things the students are also asked to address is the famous John Peter Zenger trial, or the Zenger trial there. And I was reading about it, and the more I thought about it, it seems to me that history inflates its importance to a certain degree, because one of the great takeaways from this trial is the idea of jury nullification. But as I understand it, the principle of jury nullification within our system of law is considered unconstitutional or illegal. That is, we have a Supreme Court case from 1895 that says that jurors do not have the authority to practice jury nullification. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about the importance of the Zenger case?
Well, I just happen to have a book here, and I dusted it off the shelf and pulled it out for students. This is a some guy named Levy. I don't know. He's wrote a few books, but this is all about the emergence of a free press. And John Peter Zenger is, oh my gosh, is all over this book, right? And it's interesting because we tend to think of the Zenger trial. Well, Levy's using it in talking about libel cases, and the libel cases were such a big deal. So we think about the Zenger case because of freedom of the press and establishing the freedom of the press early on, but really at the time it was probably more important because of jury nullification, which was a very interesting thing. And I think the idea of the jury system where you're going to put I can't think of another thing where 12 people get to decide what the law is, right? I mean, I don't know 12 average people that are not lawmakers. They just get a summons and they show up and, and they make it through the selection process, and then they have to decide the law. I don't know that there's any other place in American society where that happens. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, it is a jury nullification case where the judge even instructs it that truth is not a defense, which is kind of a scary thing if the truth is not a defense. However, in the Sparf case, I had to look up that you alluded to, Dave, the Sparf v. U.S. in 1895, and actually that didn't make jury nullification unconstitutional. What it did was the judges could no longer instruct juries that they had that power. So the idea, and I read part of Justice Harlan's opinion in that case in Sparf. Oh my gosh, it's like he was super mad that someone, was sliding the cheese off of his cracker. Like, these 12 people in the jury box, you guys don't know what the law is. We know what the law is. You're taking the place of judges and you have no business taking the place of judges, and yada, yada, yada. And he was super upset in his opinion. It's kind of funny.
Cheese off the cracker?
Have you been to a retirement home lately and someone's taking somebody else's cheese off
cheese
the cracker?
off the cracker? I like that.
No, you ever heard that? People get irate and their cheese slices off the cracker?
No.
We don't have those kind of sayings out here in California. That's more of a
well. I mean, there are two guys that are wearing flannel on this, so I think we should know.
That's true. That's true.
But anyway,
real quickly, Chris, how do you square, or how do we square the rule of law with jury nullification? I mean, is jury nullification is it consistent and reinforcing rule of law, or is it kind of anarchy and chaos when it comes to rule?
Well, if you read Harlan, it's jury nullification is anarchy and chaos. It's a lot of cheese off a lot of crackers. But then the dissent in Sparf said, no, this is the dissent. Actually, 3 justices dissented, and they're like, no, this is really important. This is the idea the people are sovereign, and this is what the people in the jury. There's the inviolable idea of the jury's decision is final, right? This finality of that jury decision and in the dissent in that case. But so what comes out of SPARF is the idea that, yeah, juries can still do it, but judges are not going to tell them the instructions. So
Isn't there kind
that's a
of a
great.
top down, bottom up in this? You know, elitist rule of law is only associated from the top down versus could rule of law potentially be from the bottom up? I kind of hear that framework in this.
It
in your
is, but I think
discussion,
David's
Chris.
question is a great question in terms of like, okay, so if 12 average people, I'm going to make
Yeah.
a joke, not smart enough to get out of jury duty, that's a joke. I think everybody should, that's one of the requirements of citizenship, but people do try and get out of it. Is, is that 12 average people? Do they know the law? Can you convince people that, we should, John Peter Zenger should be acquitted because the royal governor does look like a poodle? I mean,
I mean, it comes awfully close to an example of tyranny of the majority to me. This idea of, and if the rule of law means anything, it means that the rules should be applied in the same way under the same circumstances, and to allow jury nullification. I guess I'm siding with Harlan. It seems like we could just get into a very quick, chaotic situation.
yeah, but I mean, think about it. There've been a few cases, and actually in our resources, I'll put something in there about some famous ones, and one of them was for Dr. Jack Kevorkian. You guys remember Dr. Kevorkian? For the students, he was at the forefront of the death with dignity or physician-assisted suicide, depending how you look at that movement. He was on trial for participating in helping someone kill themselves, and it was based on. I won't give you can kids you can look the students you can look that up, but the jury nullified that decision. So that was a more recent example, but there are not tons of examples of jury nullification throughout history. It's a really a small group of cases.
So, Chris, is the Zenger case one of those situations in which, within its time, it's kind of the importance is jury nullification, but in hindsight, as you show us Levy's book, that freedom of the press becomes much more of a focus of that case. So over time, the importance or significance of it, I guess, historically changes. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you laid that out perfectly because, how we tend to mythologize things or, elevate things and they take on a different importance hundreds of years later. And so Zenger takes on the importance of this idea of a free press, which we, love to pat ourselves on the back about. But at the time, it was like the jury, it was more about jury nullification.
And I don't know, this might be, an unfair question. I'm just wondering, when is that? Does Levy at all identify when does that switch take on? Is it around the Bill of Rights being developed or the late 18th century?
Actually, throughout he really is laying out this in his book it becomes part of the basis of establishing a colonial free press, right? So his emphasis in the text is not necessarily on jury nullification. His emphasis on relying on Zenger so much is this establishment of a colonial, and I want to emphasize colonial free press.
Oh, okay.
It comes up in ratification occasionally, when they're creating and ratifying the Bill of Rights. There will be some references to Zenger in some speeches that are made. So, and it's in the context of press.
Well, and even in the convention, and Tim, you correct me if I'm wrong, but they talked about protecting freedom of the press and the body of the Constitution, right? But then I think the argument becomes, well, wait a minute, why are we singling this out if we don't believe we have the power to control it anyway? So why does it need to be preserved in the body of the Constitution? So they moved on from that argument.
So, Professor Williams, limited government and rule of law, and this is from my perspective, were intended and are intended to provide accountability of those who govern, accountability in government. How well do you believe do the provisions of our Constitution provide for accountability for those who govern and for the government itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think the structures of the Constitution, I think, do a pretty good job. I mean, I think the issue comes in something Chris has said numerous times on these programs. It's, we have to look at operator error in terms of how they're actually being done. So what are some of those provisions maybe we can talk about to provide that accountability? Well, I think just the separation of powers is one in terms of the different branches. No one branch having exclusive power, so there's some accountability. There's some compromise that needs to be worked out between them. I think the same thing happens between the states and the national government with federalism. Um, we've talked on numerous programs in here about how often we have elections and how the framers thought it was really important that the House every 2 years that they face election, and then we have 4 for the president and 6 for the Senate, obviously. So you take all those into account, and I would say, yeah, those features in and of itself provide the basis for accountability. Um, as things have changed the last 200 plus years, and I'll just point out two structural sort of um, reformations, I guess. The enhancement of executive power and the role of money in politics are two. I'm sure there are other ones. Those two have, I think, if not completely destroyed the structure that's in the Constitution, but it's definitely put it under a stress test. And I think if you add to that what I was referring to, Chris's comment, I came across a quote by Madison that I'm sure all of you have known before from 1788. And he's talking about the Republican principle in the Constitution. And he says, but we have to select people who have virtue and wisdom. And he says, if there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. So I think that goes for both the people who are selected and then the ways in which we are selecting those folks to serve within these structures. I think the accountability is going to be based on that as well. We've tried just in a comparative analysis. There have been societies who've taken Madisonian's system, largely in South America, and plopped it down, and just kind of people expect it to do its magic there, and it just doesn't, because the folks operating the system and in the system are just maybe have different values, or there's different cultural predispositions. So I think the structure is there for accountability, but that doesn't let all of us off the hook in terms of how we use it and how our elected leaders use it.
Well, to what degree, Mike, do you believe that norms, and norms did take a while to develop,
Yeah.
that norms were a way to
Sure.
hold individual office holders accountable? And it seems that those norms have been diminishing over the last few decades, especially in the executive branch. And I mean, what I found fascinating is I'm going to cite my source. My source is John Oliver, but his program last night was on Trump's business dealings, and in his story, he pointed out that there are no laws that forbid or require any kind of financial responsibility on behalf of the president, meaning personal finance. That is, there is no law that requires him to put or her to put things into a what's the word I'm looking for?
Blind trust.
Trust.
A blind
A
trust.
blind trust. There's not a law that requires that. That became a norm over time. There's not a law that requires the president or the candidate to share their tax returns over a period of time. That was a norm that developed there, but there is no law. I mean,
Yeah.
what does that say about the constitutional structure, that we don't have any kind of way to hold these individuals accountable other than separation of powers, I guess? I mean,
Yeah.
that seems kind of odd to me. What do you think?
No, it's a really good point. And I would say that what you're referring to as norms, I might also just call like an informal institution. So institutions are just rules and processes that are accepted and followed. Constitution and laws, we write those things down. But much of our political behavior and much of our social behavior is done through informal institutions. It's not written down, but we all know what those guardrails are. And of course, I wouldn't say that, I don't think norms just, they can change. They don't completely disappear. We have different norms than we did 50 years ago, but we're not walking around without norms. It's just that those norms have shifted. And is it dangerous when maybe the informal norms are changing to an extent that they're not aligning with what we think the formal institutions are requiring. Yeah, I think it is dangerous. But those are much harder to control, right? Was it Aristotle who said that he would evaluate a society based on how few laws it had, because he wanted to live in a society where folks didn't have to write things down. They just knew what was going to be considered appropriate behavior or not. So I think you or Oliver or both of you, yeah, you're onto something, that maybe it's at a time where there's some informal norms that have broken down, and that we need to now write up formal rules to to cover that. We do too much of that, and all of a sudden we're developing, Napoleonic codes for ourselves, which is the tradition of this country, right?
Chris or Tim, any thoughts about that?
Well, go ahead, Tim.
Well, it is an interesting thought that maybe there's this other thing called rule of custom. I mean, well, also, I think I have a couple thoughts. It's always dangerous when I'm kind of riffing on my colleagues. But is it possible that there's this thing called rule of law if it's based in common law versus there is rule of law if it's based in something called like higher law? I think Americans kind of always have wrestled with the difference there, because rule of law in a common law tradition is there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing, it's just kind of all horizontal, and whatever a formal institution's deciding equals rule of law. Whereas Americans at our founding invoked this higher law principle. And so maybe we're destined to kind of always wrestle with the meaning of rule of law. Is it based only horizontal in what our institutions or our norms expect of us, or is it based in something beyond us, a transcendent? So I think maybe Americans have always wrestled with this, really the meaning or the rootedness of what is rule of law rooted in, higher or horizontal. Common law.
Dr. King writes about that in a letter from Birmingham jail as well.
Yeah.
And that idea. And this is part of me where I get really, and I don't want to be cynical on behalf of the students, because I know that the students are, we really want to promote critical thinkers, not cynical thinkers. You got to wait till you're an old fart like us, or well, three of us, to be cynical as opposed to critical. But and I've said this before, we only practice rule of law when it's convenient. We talk about it. We talk a good game about rule of law, but all of us know enough history that we can go back in history and point out many times that there's been no accountability for wrongdoing. And so, because it's not convenient, because we don't have the political will to do that, which is frustrating. So, rule of law sounds great. But was anybody held accountable for the torture that we did on the war on terror? Was anybody held accountable for collapsing our economy in 2007, 2008? So we can go down the long list of history in these events and talk about rule of law and find out who was held accountable for violating laws. And we tend not to do that. When's the last time we executed a wealthy person in this country? A person of means,
Right. Chris, I completely agree with you. And my thought was, because I was thinking about the financial crisis as well. But one of the formal institutions we have in place is to just vote out the folks who didn't do that. So I just want to make clear, because I think you're saying this when you're talking about, we talk a good game and we don't do enough. I just don't want students to thinking it's just about the elected or the political or economic elites. I think we all have a bit to share in what you're saying in terms of the we, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because, at what point is it okay for the president to be judge, jury, and executioner in carrying out attacks on people? Because that's happened during the quote unquote war on terror. So, that certainly flies in the face. And you're right, we're all culpable in it, because we continue to vote for people and put them in positions where they can flaunt the rule of law, but we do nothing about it, except for maybe the jury booth, right? Where 12 average people get to decide the law.
Ooh, I see what you did there. Brought it right back.
Well done there, Mr. Kavanaugh.
I'm putting the cheese back on the cracker, baby.
Back on the cracker.
So Professor Moore, this question made me have to go back into the English Bill of Rights, and there are a myriad of items that are found in that document. And I don't know if I'm going outside the norm here, but I found it somewhat intriguing that one of the key principles was freedom of speech, which made me wonder how did the framers and founders, however you want to label them, view this right in the context of our constitutional arrangement? That is, to what extent does freedom of speech reinforce these ideas or principles of limited government and rule of law?
Well,
And I know that's two questions. I apologize.
well, and I'm a simple man. I can only handle one at a time. Um, I think
Oh,
the British
that's not
background, the British background on freedom of speech is interesting. I mean, we broadly define speech today as all kinds of, all kinds of speech. In the British context, they were very concerned about, and early American definitions of freedom of speech was almost entirely political. And I think there's a British legacy to that as well. I mean, kings could jail parliamentary members at will. And so it's predictable that like you referenced the English Bill of Rights, I think it's Article 8 or 9, it's probably Article 9, I think. There's this reference to, parliamentarians on the floor can say whatever they want. And we kind of adopt that too in our system. Um, congressional congressman, congressperson immunity for anything they say on the floor. So there's always a political context to the British and early American notions of what the freedom of speech is. I mean, there's also a licensing thing too that for us in newspapers is not a in our history is not even there. I mean, Britain, you had to have licenses to have a printing press and publish. Now, in our content, which meant you could be punished. Freedom of speech didn't allow you to say whatever you wanted. I mean, and this is part of the Zenger case, was it seditious libel? Was the truth dangerous and disruptive to society? Seditious libel. So the licensing is also a piece in the British context, and we choose not to adopt that for our newspapers. I mean, Blackstone, in his not Spirit of Law, that's Montesquieu, commentaries, 1760s, made the famous statement that we can there's no prior we can have prior restraint. We certainly punish you afterwards for whatever you say. And it's in a political context because political speech can be, as we know, very disruptive. So that's there. And another thing that's overlooked, I think, is petitioning. It shows up in our founding documents a lot in the colonial era and revolutionary era. Petitioning is there, but I don't think we really fully understand the importance of what petitioning meant to the American colonials, as well as British citizens too, or subjects, excuse me. Because petitioning, in a way, was the people that didn't have the right to vote. It was the way they expressed their preferences to elected officials. I think we missed that. It was kind of the practices, cultural practices of disenfranchised people pissing and moaning. And so, and predictably, I think it shows up in the American context because a lot of people didn't have the right to vote. And so petitioning is the way that their input was gauged. So, but again, that's political. I mean, we had a lot of petitions that went across the pond during the Revolutionary era to Parliament. Again, they didn't have direct representation or any representation, nor could they vote in national affairs. So petitioning was kind of that informal vote or that informal voice speech. So petitioning was a part of that.
I think in the body of the Constitution as well. Sorry, David, that not only is that debate clause protected on the floor of our new Congress, but also the traveling, right? The traveling to and from Congress, because we know that the king, he had enemies and he would harass those enemies on their way to and from Parliament. So, so that we we learned kind of a little bit of a lesson. So we had this debate clause, free speech. We had a free speech in the body of the Constitution for members of Congress. And not only that, you could travel to and from without harassment by the president or the king, right? Because of stuff we borrowed from the British.
So, Tim, I appreciate that you pointed out that this, at least in the English Bill of Rights and within our early, it's about a political right. It's also about the right within the institutions of government, in many ways, as far as the legacy of the English Bill of Rights goes. And I am wondering, to what extent, we were just talking about norms, and the idea of the norms of political speech on the floor of the House and the Senate, and therefore you wanted protection if you were in opposition, from the majority. But did they anticipate the kind of language and the kind of topics that would be brought up today? I guess my question is, do you think we still have reverence for the kind of freedom of speech they were talking about in the English Bill of Rights and in our own political development? Do we still have the same reverence for free speech that we did back then?
Well, again, I may be taking exception to the premise of your question,
Please
Professor
do.
Richmond. I think, well, there's the state story, there's the national story. You read some of the stuff that occurred in colonial legislatures, and the stories about the kinds of people that are in the lower houses of the colonial legislatures. There wasn't much sophisticated political rhetoric. But in an early republic, there was a lot of the elites were a little disgruntled with the kinds of folks that were showing up into state governments, as well as, I mean, Adams had to sit and listen to all kinds of dopey people in the Senate when he was vice president, and wrote Abigail all the time about that. But I would say, I've mentioned this book before. It's called Fields of Blood, A Field of Blood. It is it will disabuse you of any notion of civility and high and lofty political rhetoric in Congress. I mean, this stuff was just I mean, today's rhetoric, we get all a flutter and rattle, we clutch our pearls when somebody, says something aggressive, and the media plays it up. But man, oh man, in the 1840s and 50s, Congress, the book by Joanne Freeman is aptly titled, It Was a Field of Blood. It was that, and the rhetoric was bad, the behavior was awful. So we've had times much worse than what we have right now.
Well, and again, and that's why I asked it, because there is this modern notion that somehow we've lost sight of some foundation, some norm of civil behavior and civil engagement. Whereas what you've taught me over the years is you go back to the 18th century. No, now I am wondering, I mean, there's the name calling and that, but I'm wondering about the world of alternative facts. All right, that goes on today, and people just manufacturing stories out of nowhere that have no basis in truth. Was that also a phenomenon of American politics in the 18th century?
A little bit, but we have so much of it now. I don't know that it's a difference in kind. It's a different in degree, I think. I back when I was in the classroom, maybe you guys have done this too. Did you ever show your students Speakers Tuesday or whatever in England, where the prime minister has to show up and answer, and they rah, 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 and it's like most of my students were like, what the heck is that? That seems unruly, but it's like that's their institution that has this norm of saying mean and nasty things and not paying attention and making fun of them. So well, I think that's a wonderful example of norms within an institution that's very different than what our modern sensibilities are.
Chris, you were going to jump in. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna refer to the gag rule. When Congress puts down a gag rule, that they couldn't even discuss slavery. So, that tells you how volatile things were, that this one subject was so bad and led to such violence and threats that, we're just going to refuse to talk about it. So it's kind of like the anti-free speech.
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, this conversation, it seems to me, I just want to highlight for the students how it might be forcing all of us to rethink an assumption we have, right? Like maybe the assumption should be, how has there ever been a time in American history where we haven't seen kind of the vitriol and the stuff happen? Because I've been listening, doing a lot of reading about thinking about the Cold War period and how that shaped politics. And I don't have anything other than just a hypothesis here. I'm just becoming more and more convinced that this this period from the 40s through the 70s ish, there was kind of like even through the 80s, kind of this Republicans kind of they agreed to the principles of the New Deal for the most part. There was a lot of collaboration because we were so fearful of the Soviet Union. And I'm really convinced that when you look at history, you look at 1990, 1992, and it seems like the gloves come off once the Cold War ends, and that we maybe are reverting not to something new, but to something that's very familiar. That actually what a lot of us lived through during the Cold War was the exception to the rule
Yeah.
of how politics actually works.
So, oh, Chris is,
Well,
I don't know your
I'm
Bob.
just thinking of, McCarthyism and what happens with McCarthyism and how ugly that becomes, when you have a member of Congress kill himself because he's worried about his son being outed because of McCarthy holding it over his head. That's yeah, there is the idea that we're going to come together to fight the godless commies, but
Well, I agree with it. I mean, it's a good example, Chris, but even that, there was a bipartisan disdain and pushback against McCarthy. Remember, it was a female Republican senator, all right, who went on the floor to condemn him first. And President Eisenhower clearly didn't have a lot of love and wanted him shut down.
But Eisenhower didn't, he was not until he went after the army. When Ike started to draw the line, right? When McCarthy, because Roy Cohn couldn't get a pass to go visit his lover and get his lover a pass to come off base to visit him. And so that's when McCarthy starts challenging the army. And then when McCarthy takes on the army, that's when Ike said, okay, I'm not, we're done. We're not
I think I might agree with Mike on this one, because I mean I can't help but think about the Revolutionary War consensus, and then when the bad guys are gone, there's all kinds of divisions that develop within the American culture. So, I mean, I hear you on McCarthyism, but it just I'm a little hesitant to accept the arguing from the exception. So I think Mike's point's well taken, that whenever you got a boogeyman, there's a consensus for a while. Now, how much of a consensus? I think that's Chris's point is well taken.
well,
There might
yeah,
be something to that consensus theory.
well, I mean, I agree that, I think of President Bush, giving his address, and he borrows a bullhorn, W. Bush, after 9/11, and he gives
Yeah.
that address in New York City on the rubble of the World Trade. And, that was what brings families together, funerals and weddings.
Yeah.
And what brings our nations together is to have that common enemy or that common catastrophe. And then we tend to come together. But then when that threat is removed,
Yeah.
then we're back at each other. And maybe, like Mike's point is well made, that that's exactly who we are.
So, Chris, the writs of assistance obviously was a major source of grievance that becomes a ammunition and justification for independence, revolution, and such. And I was thinking about this, about the application. That is what we learned from that. Yet I found a number of scholars who question the viability or the long-term lesson of the English writs of assistance when we look at American criminal justice. And the fact that many argue that that American law in the late 20th and 21st century abandoned these historical concerns towards governmental searches. And we look at exceptions made under the Fourth Amendment. We look at the impact of 9/11, on search and seizure. So I'm wondering what you think about that. The long-term lessons of the writs of assistance. Do they live within our political culture, or are they what you said about rule of law? Is it kind of a roller coaster with that?
Well, at first I got to give a shout out to my boy James Otis, because I mean, when he's arguing against the writs, on behalf of Boston merchants in the trials against writs of assistance cases, which I'm sure the students will be familiar with, the idea of a general warrant, which leads to specific language in our Fourth Amendment. But when he's making that argument in 1763 in Boston, you've got a young attorney sitting there, and we all know the famous line. That young attorney is John Adams. He said, "There, the child of independence was born." I'm paraphrasing. I don't think I have that exactly right, but he's saying that. I mean, so, and we talk about, when does the revolution begin? Is it in 1775 at Lexington and Concord? Is it 1776 when we do the Declaration, or is it in 1763 when we're challenging British law and we're changing the mindset of the colonists, and based upon this Enlightenment thinking on this social contract? So, Otis is arguing against these writs of assistance, and, you can draw a direct line from that to the specific warrant requirements in the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
After that, I'm going to say, see Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, because what do we fear? We fear the violent death at the hands of another. And when we become afraid, all of those rights that we believe, and all these checks on the government, when we become afraid, we're okay with the government perhaps violating those, as long as I'm going to be safe. I mean, if you've flown recently, right, and you have to go through the scanner, hold the hands up, and they take that picture of you to make sure you don't have any thing on you, because what we don't want to, we fear the violent death at the hands of another. We don't want to be blown up at 30,000 feet, which makes sense. But then when there's a stress to the system, and I would even go back even earlier, David, to the Sedition and Espionage Acts of 1917, 1918. And you look at what happens to people for search and seizure as well as speech. And my goodness, right? What we would think of as abuses, but the court is okay with it. The court is okay with it. Fast forward to the war on terror, and the idea of what the Patriot Act allows for, that was passed pretty quickly. And the only person I can think of that was saying, wait a minute, maybe we should read it, was Tim's former Senator Russ Feingold, which cost him an election. He's saying, wait, maybe we should read what's in here, because how much power do we want to give the government? And I think, again, back to the Leviathan and Hobbes, and when we become afraid, we're willing to give that government the power because there's a threat. But when the threat subsides, does the right return? And I don't know that it has. So I would stand by my earlier comment about rule of law. We're willing to take the Fourth Amendment, which of course, it's written and ratified in 1791. We're still using that to decide whether or not, when the government can crack open my phone, which seems a little antiquated.
Well, and I think about, I mean, the Fourth Amendment, and remember, it's not incorporated until the 1960s, as far as Map v. Ohio. But before that, we got 100 years, all right, of municipal police departments doing warrantless searches.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm wondering, okay, so where is this historical lesson about writs of assistance? Where is that found in our state governments?
Yeah, it's not. That's the thing, is like, we're tapping.
So why in the HE double toothpicks are we emphasizing this writs of assistance lesson? And I know Otis is your man. Hey, Otis, he's your man. But I'm just having a hard time figuring out, where is this lesson? When we look at our own legal culture.
I'm with you. I'm with you. It's like, again, we're talking a good game. We're talking a good game.
Okay. Yes.
Is hypocrisy in a way a tribute to virtue? Okay, so we're hypocrite. I mean, we are. I mean, it's a great point. 100 years of local municipal abuses. Okay, now that's a lot of hypocrisy. But is it possible to still be have some commitment to a virtuous principle? Now, and a lot of this has to do with just your temperament too. I generally take very few principled stands on much of anything constitutionally, but but that didn't come out well, did it?
I'm wondering whose temperament you have a problem with.
My own actually, because I do waffle quite a bit. So, but all I'm saying is it possible for hypocrisy to exist, but there still be a commitment to an ideal? I mean, in that I'm reading a book right now on this very principle that we're going to be talking about later. Um, so yeah, Chris is right. I mean, you're right. 100 years of local municipal abuses. I guess I'm not willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater on that.
Okay. Professor Williams, you have any comment on baby bathwater hypocrisy principle?
Yeah.
Any
Cheese
of
and
those?
crackers. Cheese and crackers.
Well, hey, if Chris, by the way, Chris's cheese analogy is wonderful for a guy like me in Wisconsin. This is a great phrase I'm going to use.
I just can't. You said at the very beginning that we were doing a disservice to fifth graders, I think, and I think we're continuing with that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Professor Williams, I think the most obvious question when we talk about uh, contemporary challenges to these principles of limited government and rule of law, we have to look at the judiciary and the Supreme Court and their perspective on this
Yeah.
principle. So I'm wondering how you read Trump versus United States, this last session of the court last year, ending in June of 2024, in regards to the principles of limited government and rule of law. Do you agree with a lot of the critics who say that the court pretty much talk about baby bathwater, did throw out the baby and with the bathwater when it comes to rule of law in that decision? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do agree with the critics. I reread the decision today, and students, I'm going to tell you what I think, and I'm sure, I know Chris has an opinion on this. I know Dave does, and I think Tim even getting into presentism might. So, but I really encourage you to read, at least read Roberts, the majority opinion, and then read Sotomayor's dissent, and make up your own mind about who you think has the better legal historical argument. I mean, just for you students, just the basis of it is, the question is for the court, could a president ever be under what circumstances could a president be charged with a crime for something he does while occupying the office of being president? And the court basically says, for his or her core functions, the president has absolute immunity. The court gave us some ideas of what core functions were. They're the ones in the Constitution. Commander in chief is one of them, providing pardons. So what that means on the court's rationale is that a president could ask for money for a pardon and give the pardon based on getting the money, and that president would never face any criminal liability for that, either in office or after that person is out of office, because that is a core function. Then there are other official acts, the court says, that are more than just the core functions. And the court kind of says, oh, we're going to kick it down to the courts and let them decide the difference between official acts and core responsibilities. But even those official acts, presidents should have a presumption of immunity. The court's rationale for this, it seems to me, is based on one argument one founder made about the importance of an energetic executive, it seems to me. And while they never mention unified executive theory, it seems to just be within that sort of ideology of that the executive has a lot more power than what the Constitution provides. And I'll finish here in a second. Sotomayor starts her dissent by saying, this is a court that has spent a lot of time the last 5-10 years talking to us about history, text. And she says, nowhere in the text can they find an argument that says presidents are immune. And to Chris's and Tim's point earlier, they knew how to give special privileges or immunity to folks. They give it to members of Congress. Like, it's in Article 1, right? Section 6. So they knew how to do it. And then Sotomayor goes through much more of the debate around this, even Hamilton said in Federalist 69, I imagined him to quell the fears of the anti-federalists. He said, well, this by no means means that a president could never be charged for a crime, right? So I'm sorry, Dave, to get to the point, it seems to me like this decision has really put down a rule that is so clear, so black and white, that it means that a person occupying presidency can literally get away with crimes and not fear prosecution, whether they're, and this is the final point I'll make, the court didn't even consider the fact that it made a difference that Trump was no longer in office when this was coming up. Because I could maybe see a court's rationale of, we can't have presidents being charged with crimes all the time, right? Maybe they're baseless. I'm saying I could maybe buy it. But when that person is out of office, it seems like that would be an easier sort of exception to make. Anyways, I think this decision is going to have a lasting effect, until it's overturned or unless there's a different interpretation. It's not based very well in, from what I could see, in terms of the Constitution or in history or in tradition. It's a very interesting and I think wrongly decided case.
And please don't apologize. I appreciate the coverage you provided there. And at minimum, you've now relieved Professor Moore from having to read the case, because I think he spent his presentism on the Project 2025 document. That's all the reading he ever wants to do on present kind of
Yeah,
issues.
I'm
So, Jim,
done.
you don't have to read the case anymore. Mike did a good job covering that.
Well, but let me make this perverse argument, Mike.
Mm.
Um, you know, in a way, isn't the court saying, hey, down the road, we're going to be the rule of law to make the balls and strikes calls when cases come to us about executive action? So they're kind of saying there is rule of law. It's just that it's coming to us later for us to define what's official and what's not.
No,
Okay.
because the court is basically, I mean, no court or act of Congress, if it's a core, there's nothing the court can do. You know what I mean? If the
Yeah.
president says, as commander in chief, I did this act,
Yeah.
there's no action for a court to take.
Well, it's one thing to call for me to call it an official action, but isn't there a glimmer of opportunity for courts to decide whether that was official action or not? I don't know.
No, this is part of the immunity issue, because now that
Yeah.
you can't even question why he was talking to his attorney general, because of course he's going to talk to his attorney general. So even if he's talking to his attorney general about opening up cases against your political enemies list, you don't, that motivation cannot be brought in. So
Well, I think isn't it right now still somewhat fuzzy because of the January 6th case? They've given it back to the trial judge,
yes,
who has to
Judge Chuckin.
decide whether or not these are part of his core powers. And so there seems to be a little bit of fuzziness remaining on this. Would that be accurate, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there are three buckets, it seems to me. There are core responsibilities, and if a court defines something as a core constitutional responsibility, it's absolute immunity, no questions asked. If it's an official act, there's a presumption of immunity, but there can be a compelling interest, and then there's unofficial acts. So you're right, David, but I think Sotomayor makes a pretty good case that
Oh, she does.
even in the official acts, that there's enough there where, a lawyer is going to be able to make the argument of, we are within the bounds of what the Supreme Court said in this decision. So, I mean, who knows how the litigation will come out, but it's
Right.
making it very, very hard to get that cheese on this particular cracker. This is going to be tough.
Okay. Gentlemen, we've come to the end of our hour, and I know we could go on and
I'm
on.
hungry. I'm
Yeah,
hungry.
on and on about this. So let's get to our tradition here, and any final thoughts, recommendation, insights for the students and teachers about Unit 1, Question 3. And we need to give Professor Williams a few minutes to recover here. So Professor Kavanaugh, final thoughts, recommendation.
I would have you make sure you paid attention to the way Tim respectfully disagreed with the premises of the question, right? So that's and we say this not just necessarily for this unit, but for all units. You don't have to accept that. But if you're going to be a contrarian, you better make sure you have your ducks in a row, right? If you're going to challenge the premise of a question, you better make sure you have a good reason for challenging that premise of the question, especially if you're given a binary choice on something. For this, I think this is interesting, and I think our discussion throughout this plays out for this unit. We talk a good game about things, right? We talk about these principles, these constitutional principles, whether they be from Magna Carta, whether the English Bill of Rights, Petition of Right, colonial documents. We talk about this, but what's actually like on the ground? And you think about Dave's last question to me about the Fourth Amendment. We have these principles in the Fourth Amendment, but really we didn't follow them for a long period of time. So what we write down and what we do are usually different. So just make sure you understand that.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I would urge students, one of the things we did inherit from the British legacy, colonial experiences, in historians and political scientists have called it this Whig dissenting tradition. We inherited a Whig suspicion. And so, look into the meaning of Whig suspicion in the British context. It was against royal power. But Americans have inherited that suspicion of any form of centralized power. Now, of late, I don't know that we're strong Whigs the way we used to be about suspicions of power. I mean, there are people advocating, quasi-authoritarian or authoritarian systems right now. So, but I think it's worth looking into that Whig suspicion tradition in how we've appropriated that as Americans, and how maybe are we abandoning that Whiggish suspicion now when it comes to executive power, or should it reassert itself? So I'd look into that tradition, that political tradition of Whig suspicion.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, what I like about this question, I'm not a Unit 1 expert. I've always believed, though, that the curriculum and We the People has a circular quality to it, that Unit 1 and Unit 6 are these interesting sort of roommates. And I think this question does a really good job of forcing Unit 1 teams to really think about how these principles are actually being, I think the word is tested, or how they're applied today. So I think that makes for this question to be a little less historical and a little less abstract, and an opportunity to talk about, and in fact, you need to talk about contemporary issues and how you see that fitting in with these principles, even if you disagree with the assumption. Meaning, we may have inherited some traditions like the Whig tradition, and 99% of Americans couldn't tell you anything about what that means or anything. But the fact that most of us would be like, yeah, most of us don't like centralized government. You students, where it's coming from. So it's your job to sort of remind us of that, and then show us how that is being challenged in today's current political environment.
And I apologize to students and teachers if my questions didn't guide us into far more historical discussion. My assumption was that you're all at a point where you can easily look up and read about the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights and some of their detail and make the connections. Plus the textbook does some of that. I did want to, and I think the question, at least the last bullet, does take us into a more contemporary setting about these principles, just to understand the method to my madness. If in the last analysis there is one thing you walk away with, and that is never steal the cheese from another person's cracker, we've done our job as old men trying to shape the virtue of a future generation there. So in our next episode, we'll be talking about a topic from Unit 6 on slavery and its long-term impact on our constitutional design and current issues of civil rights and voting rights. Until then, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.